Okay, so with this part, it's just going to be a brief one. Before we do, in the next part 16, I believe, is going to be a longer one, and it's going to be a bit. There's just going to be more in it. So, given that part 14 was quite a big one as well, this one's just kind of going to be a brief video, and in order to process just a couple of things, consolidate a couple of things before we move on. So it should hopefully give you a chance to just, I suppose, catch your breath. So what we're going to talk about in this one's two loose threads. One is just the nature of the poetic, what I'm calling the poetic ambiguities, the four different kinds of ambiguities, and then just elaborating a little bit more on what I refer to as the developmental key, or the how this framework ties into poetic development practically, and what poetry teachers and mentors effectively need to be able to do in order to be able to help facilitate that development. So let's get into it. So here are the four poetic ambiguities. I should probably also just, I've called them the four endemic poetic ambiguities. We could also call them the four intrinsic ambiguities, which is another way of saying that in any poem, at any stage of development, you're going to get all kinds of ambiguities. There's that well-known book by, I believe it was Empson, who wrote about the 7 different kinds of ambiguities, on a line-by-line level, on a symbolic level, etc. I'm not talking about those kinds of ambiguities, which we could maybe call extrinsic ones. I'm talking about the ones that are intrinsic to the mode of engagement that each stage is working with. So they are, just quickly, and then I'll go into each one in more depth. Private ambiguity at the sentimental stage, performed ambiguity at the scholarly stage, profound ambiguity at the sensing stage, and prophetic ambiguity at the scrying stage. So I got the term for private ambiguity from something that Northrop Frye once said about how the poet ultimately needs to be able to, or the literary writer needs to be able to employ the conventions of literature. Otherwise, they fall into a kind of enclosed private symbolism that doesn't actually speak to people. And there's a bit of that I'm kind of drawing on, or kind of loading into this term, or capturing with this term. Private ambiguity if it is ultimately about the poet themselves, as it tends to be at this stage, there's going to be an intrinsic ambiguity that comes with the fact that it is private. We don't know exactly the circumstances around the emotion. We don't even exactly know sometimes what the emotion is, because it's kind of expressed in a loose way. We don't know what some of the symbols or the names are, because it is, again, primarily written to express an emotion, to purge an emotion, to be more precise, and use the term we came up with when we were talking about the different processes of each stage. So this is this actually ties into the if we recall from the previous video, the 4 stages of wine drinking: the casual drinker, the connoisseur, the vigneron, and the terroirist. So the casual drinker is, I suppose, there's going to be an ambiguity if they were to create wine. They aren't doing so in a conversation with, I guess, like the tradition of winemaking, the different flavor profiles of the wine. They don't yet have a language or conceptualization or a language for that. And so they are trying to they would, if they were trying to create wine, effectively be creating or trying to translate their own private experience of it into wine. And that's kind of what an amateur or amateur alcohol maker of any kind does. And so there's a kind of, that's the ambiguity that's intrinsic on that level. At the scholarly level, the connoisseur, there's a performed ambiguity. And this is something I'm going to elaborate on in the next slide. We're going to talk about the nature of the performativity here. But like the connoisseur, it is effectively it is performative in the sense that it's trying to, how do I put this? It is in conversation with the tradition of winemaking and the classifications within the winemaking world around wine. But it doesn't yet have the, as we said, the inside knowledge. It isn't like the vigneron at the sensing stage, actually in the field with that intimate, in-depth relation to what is being communicated to the wine. And so there is an element to which the scholar is performing. And if you actually look at the poetics and the criticism around the scholarly mode, that's very much how they construct or conceptualize or frame their poetry. Geoffrey Hill talks about quote-unquote voicing, this notion that we have these, and that's sort of poetry 101, is that the speaker of the poem is not the same as the author of the poem. Like the speaker in the poem, the persona is different. That's what we teach students. I'm also an English teacher. That's what we teach straight away when we're doing poetry. So, and that's because, if you recall the different planes, the emotional plane, expressive plane, mental plane, the scholar is moving out of that identification out of the solar plexus, out of talking about themselves, and they're shifting from the personal to the impersonal. But because they haven't yet got a relation to anything deeper and more living, the actual living vine, it's still performative. It's more complex than the private ambiguity. And because it's performed, it's kind of, we could almost call it a public ambiguity in a way. It's the opposite. It's something that's translatable and accessible to people. But it doesn't yet have what the sensing poet has, which is a profound ambiguity, when they're tapping into something that is, they actually have that direct relationship to something living. And it's that the complexity and the ambiguity of that thing that's living, which is profound. And this is something that I want to clarify. I've had a few people just generally, when engaging with my work, and I do think that I'm writing at that stage, and I'm aiming for that. That I don't see a point in doing the performativity stuff or the private stuff. The point very much for me is the profundity of relating to real lessons, or the profundity of real lessons. And I've had a couple of people say, your work is ambiguous or hard to understand sometimes. And it's just made me clear of a distinction for me, which is that I think the sensing poet is writing to not for them to be understood, which is more the sentimental stage, and not necessarily to inspire a love of the form, which is a scholarly, but to be this transparent medium through which the reader is connected to the essence. So that's what the poem and the poet becomes. The poem and the poet are both a medium of the relation between the reader and the essence, which is another way of saying that the sensing poet is reading to be understood. Like he or she wants the essence to be understood. He isn't writing to create an ambiguous effect. That's a byproduct of the reader maybe not yet knowing how to relate to the essence, and so it doesn't quite make sense, or because it's not just on the reader, it can also be on the poet, failing to adequately bring the essence through. But at the same time, if you try to make the essence too accessible, you lose the essence, and you make it something else, something easier to relate to, sure, but also not the essence. It becomes twice or thrice removed from the actual essence. And then what's the point of that? Because that's now moving in the scholarly domain, in terms of it being a bit more of this performative thing. And that goes against the modus operandi of the sensing stage. So that's the profound ambiguity. And then at the scrying stage, we have the terrorist, who is has prophetic ambiguity, which is just another way of saying that when we read their works, and because they're consciously engaging with the genius of the field, and manifesting it, realizing it, there's an abundance of meaning, not in the kind of performative slippage that happens. That's a Derridian term, at the scholarly stage, which ultimately leads nowhere. It's like a hall of mirrors. And it can, I won't go into that. I could keep digressing on all of these points, but I'm trying to be relatively concise here. So it's not the Derridian slippage, it is a vision. So it just means that there is a clear, distinct, it's abstract and it's large, and it's real, but it is like a whole, in other words. But we, as readers, haven't yet become acute in our sight enough to be able to, and our understanding, deep enough in our understanding to actually see it. And so we experience it, I think, as a kind of prophetic ambiguity. But also, that's the reader's side of it. I think intrinsic to the prophetic mode, to the scrying mode, is it touches on patterns of reality which are, by their nature, more than just one, their particular, they're archetypal. They're more than just how they've been grounded and instantiated They're more than just in the poet's work. They are something that has an applicability across many different domains into the future as well. Now we're sort of harkening back, in a sense, to the 4 different temporalities. But just put that out of your mind. We don't need to needlessly complexify this. And so that would be the prophetic ambiguity that's intrinsic to the scrying mode. So I think that sort of clarifies, I think, the 4 different ambiguities. It's important to recognize that. Maybe I could just say one more word on the profound ambiguity, because that's the one that I have experienced more directly. A sensing poet is writing to have his or her essence understood and related to in its fullness. But it is the nature of that fullness that, if we do it right as poets, we don't reduce it. And so there's something about the way that we experience that as profound. And I don't understand yet fully why it is profound. It is similar, I think, to the prophetic in that it has a applicability across many domains, in essence does, into the future. It has something to do with that as well. It's just that the prophetic ambiguity it's maybe more immediately clear that is the case, because the scryer has the understanding that the sensor doesn't quite yet have. And so it comes across more crisply, we could say. Okay, so those are the 4 ambiguities. On to the next part of this video. Actually, just before I do move on, I just wanted to just make the final point that the scholar's knowledge of the conventions, literary conventions, are not performative. They do actually know them. They know them very, very well. Comparatively to the sentimental. It's just that the nature of that knowledge is intrinsically a performance. In other words, to know the conventions of something is still it's a knowledge of the externals of the form, right? It's not yet a knowledge of the spirit that generated those forms, which is the complete understanding, which is what the sensing poet is relating to and what the scrying poet actually understands. They understand the spirit beneath the form that's manifesting these conventions. And you can't really understand conventions without the spirit. You'll create work that looks like it looks to undiscerning people as though it is on the sensing level or on the scrying level, that it is profound, right? Profound is a key word there, but it isn't actually. And that's why it is still technically a performance. And that's why the ambiguity is performed ambiguity rather than profound ambiguity. And I think that wraps that up now. So now we can move on to development. So the developmental key, I'll just read out what I've got here because it says exactly what I'm trying to get at. We lack an understanding of the kind of moves we need to make as poetry mentors because we lack an understanding of the 4 stages and how to move people through them. Okay, so because we don't have any kind of a grip on the overarching trajectory of development, we aren't very good as poetry teachers and mentors. We don't know what we need to do to support them, because we don't even know where they are or where they're going. And so it's a bit like just taking a wander in the dark. And so what this framework makes clear for us is that we need to, and this is what we touched on in the last video, we need to move people through these stages, not by rushing them, but by helping them to fulfill what is alive for them. I would, if we can accept, I'm not saying we have to, but just as a thought experiment, if we accept reincarnation and that there are multiple lives and we develop across these lives, I think it becomes clear that that people will likely spend their life at one stage of development, because that is what is alive to them. That's what excites them. That's what drives them. That's what fulfills them. If they were to try and rush to another stage, that they wouldn't be able to, because they don't have the capabilities or sensitivities. And what they would end up doing would be to produce a simulation of it that wouldn't be fulfilling to them anyway, and it wouldn't be good work. It's weird that to say, but someone at the sentimental stage who is actually meant to be there, who embodies and inhabits that stage fully, owns it, even if they're not conscious of it, is someone who's writing poetry that is actually viable poetry that reaches people. Likewise for the other stages of development, and that is better than the kind of poetry they would write if they were to try and copy something else that's not them. It wouldn't be the same. It would read as almost a hypothetical, anemic in a way. Okay, so what do we do? We need to help them fulfill what's alive for them, and we do this by affirming the emotional realities of sentimental poets. So basically we're just, if you remember the 4 purposes across each stages, we're basically tying up, we're consolidating that purpose for them. In order for the poet to achieve their purpose at their stage, the reader needs to play a role in that as well. So we need to affirm sentimental poets, appreciate the scholarly poems, appropriate the essence of senses, and anagogically relate to the vision of skies. And that's what gives them the feedback that they're looking for, which helps them to grow, and helps them to grow in their confidence and ability until they more fully embody their stage. And when there's sort of a critical mass that's reached in terms of just their growth in that stage, they kind of culminate it. For T.S. Eliot, that's like writing The Wasteland. And they culminate the stage. And that's what eventually leads to them becoming their body that they've built. You can almost conceive of it almost as a bit of a alchemical stone metaphor as well, to bring that into it. But the stone, that is the poet themselves, becomes translucent to the next stage. So also their poems as well become translucent to the next stage. So what poetry teachers need to do is they need to engage on the right level for the poets to develop. We can also add in hints of other stages as well, because it's good for poets to know there is this broader sequence, so long as we're not doing that in a way that makes them feel like they need to rush through it, which is a very human tendency that doesn't work in practice anyway, but we can save them the time and effort by making that clear. That wraps up this part of this video. the next video we'll get into, we'll start diving into some more, into deeper territory. Thanks for listening.